Hey everyone, welcome back. Good to see you. Kevin and I are here doing another, episode of Revisiting the Road to Serfdom, going over F.A. Hayek's seminal work. If you watched our previous episodes, you'll see we're up to chapter 5 is what we're going to cover today. So we've done some on the introduction, which is huge and it's worth getting into. I'm not going to get into it now. But there was just so many releases of the book. We talked about that. And then chapters 1, 2, 3 and 4. And then today we're going to go over just chapter 5. We talked about it. We're like, because in the other episodes, we at least would record doing 2 chapters at a time. And there's just so much in chapter 5 that we're just going to keep it at chapter 5 today. We'll probably end up doing that with 6 as well, but we'll see. But Kevin, for the folks at home, you want to give them an update on, or not an update, but like a summary of what the last, content we covered, whether it's just the last few chapters or whatever, to kind of bring them up to speed a little bit.
Sure. So I believe this is chapter 4 we're going to be going into now. Chapter 1 covered all the introduction material. Oh, not chapter 4, episode 4 covering chapter 5. There we go. But episode 1 covered the introductory material. Episode 2 covered chapter 1 and 2. Episode 3, they covered chapter 3 and 4. So chapter 3, titled Individualism and Collectivism, covers how there are some instances in which a central entity like the government can play a role in certain services, but it should never play that role at the expense of competition, or what he calls planning against competition. So the nice thing about Hayek, or you can say it's a nice thing, but he's someone who he says he's not dogmatic in his laissez-faire attitude. He does not believe, he's not the Ayn Randian type of free markets or nothing. It's like, no, the government can play a role in preserving individual liberty, which is really what the free markets are supposed to do. So he recognizes that, and he kind of points that out a little bit in chapter 3, while also saying, all right, when it starts to plan against competition, when it starts to eliminate competition, that is when that central authority has gone too far, and we should look to the free exchange rather than the government to help us out in this particular sector. And then chapter 4 is called The Inevitability of Planning, and that dives into monopolies and how they're almost exclusively created by private business colluding with the government, and how the promise of a planned economy run by experts is one of the quickest ways to go down the road towards tyranny. Yep. I mean, both of those are really illuminating, the left, the modern day left, who is more of what we're going to call the American version of liberalism, which is the complete opposite of the European 19th century version of liberalism, where they try to get away from all forms of coercion by the state, where the American version is the exact opposite, where they want to involve the state in everything. They make you scared of monopolies. If monopolies are this, it just is a natural occurring thing in the world of free markets. Well, no, monopolies are almost always formed by a private business colluding with the government, because it shuts out their competition, and they already have those resources to be able to, or normally it's through taxation, or Fight for 15 is a big one. Fight for 15
you
helps
mentioned the
Amazon.
Fight for 15 last time. It's like, bring on $15 minimum wage. Like
Amazon, that ain't going to hurt them, or if it, they have to tighten their margins. Well, guess who can't tighten their margins? The mom and pop shop that's trying to sell the goods, some of the good, of a very small fraction of goods that Amazon can. And then the other side of it is that planned economy run by experts. I mean, we talked about Dr. Fauci. I think he could even come up today, honestly, because he goes into experts again, and how that kind of single-minded thinking, an expert who's trying to get rid of this pandemic doesn't care that much about the economy or social life or all that stuff, because he's just got this one area of expertise that his plan is to eliminate this one thing, but it's going to be at the expense of all these other things that, are not in his purview. It's something he just cares a lot less about. And that's a great way to go down the road of tyranny. And that's where we're at, chapter 5.
Yep. And one thing, I think you mentioned earlier when we were talking that I do agree with, was you said that this chapter almost would, make more sense, a little bit earlier in the book.
Say before
than
chapter
it is
3.
now. Huh?
I think before chapter 3, I think this one, chapter 3 and 4 really went into the economics aspect of it, which is someone who loves economics. I really love that. But I think, this chapter really dives into why this economics part is so important in everything else. Something we're going to get into a little later. It's like, if they control this little chunk of the economy directly, via that direct control, they can indirectly control a whole bunch of different stuff as well. And when we just think economics, people, especially during COVID, they're like, well, is your investments as important as human lives? Well, those things are not indirect.
They're not different.
They're
not different necessarily.
People think the economy is just about money. No, economy is about behavior. That is what the study of the economy
Quality of
does, the study of
life,
behavior.
livelihood.
And it's a great way to assess, the health of a country is through its economy and understanding the different behaviors in that economy.
Totally. And one thing I think that, for people, listening now, to let you know is that, this is a book. One of the reasons why we're going over this, this thought I just had, but as we're sharing, is that one of the reasons we're going over this is because it's not just because it's a neat book to read, but it's because it has a lot of relevance and speaks into the nature of so many things we're dealing with now, in terms of where we're at with our government, the size of our government, the scope of our government, and like where this government is trying to go. And I'm not saying that, we were some, completely, weren't bogged down with bureaucracies until Joe Biden or whoever's controlling Joe Biden got in office. Not at all. But my point is that this book speaks to a lot of the pathologies within our political system and our social system, or I guess just our, I don't know what you call it, just our society today. And so that's one of the reasons why we're doing just chapter 5, is because chapter 5 has so many pieces that tie directly into what's going on right now. And so we're going to try and really marry these ideas and the problems that Hayek is pointing out and map that onto where we're at now, in terms of the things we're facing. So that said, do you care if I read this John Stuart Mill quote from the very beginning here? Adam Smith.
So chapter 5 is titled Planning and Democracy.
Yep.
And surprisingly, it talks about planning and democracy. So
I know, shocking.
Intro to chapter 5.
Shocking stuff. Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I think that we've covered this before, but you went over the definition of liberalism. For people who maybe haven't caught the other episodes, planning was a word that they used that was basically a way of and he actually gets into this a little bit at the very beginning of this chapter, but they would talk about, like, we need planning. Planning is another way of saying is that the government, like, there's a couple different ways that you can basically organize the society, especially on an economic level, is you can give individuals the freedom and liberty to choose their own things they want to do. I value X, you value Y. We're just going to live in a system where, as long as my X doesn't like harm your Y or whatever, then I can go and pursue my thing. You go and pursue your thing. But there are some people look at that and say, well, that's chaos. No one's in charge of that. That's just chaos. So we need
lack of plan.
Exactly. It's a lack of a plan. And so I think the thing I said last time was, no one's telling the fish which way to go in the ocean. But if you look at the way these schools go by each other and different fish do the different things, like, it's very organized. But they don't need, Atlantis or the king of Atlantis or whatever his name is, Aquaman, down there telling them to do that. But they're the planners look at society and say, this is way too chaotic. The fact that there are some people who don't take responsibility for their lives or whatever thing, or maybe I just want power, or maybe I'm naive, whatever. So someone needs to be at the top directing all of the activities and the goals of everyone, like all of their energy towards one common goal, one common thing. So that's what planning is. And so what Hayek is talking about here is he does something similar that he did. I believe, chapter 3 was called Individualism and Collectivism. And he's saying these two things are fundamentally different. They're fundamentally at odds. They cannot coexist. And so what Hayek is saying here is planning and democracy can't coexist permanently. We'll get into a thing at the end where some people might use democracy to bring about planning, but that doesn't mean they can coexist. It just means that you can vote yourself into despotism. So here's this quote that I think really sets it up nicely from Adam Smith. He says, the statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted to no council and senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. Adam Smith. And so he's saying that a person, like, no one person or even just small group of people has the wisdom and the moral purity to direct all of society. They don't. And so he's saying the most dangerous people are the ones who think they could actually do it. That's the Boromir thing. I could wield the ring. I can do it. Like, this has corrupted everyone else, but I can do it. Real despotism or real tyranny hasn't been tried yet. I'm benevolent. So that's a really good quote here that he's saying, because he gets into, and you've got a bunch of really good quotes here at the beginning, that where he gets into this thing of like, look, you can't, these things can't coexist. You can either have a bunch of people pursuing their own things, or you can have one group telling everyone else what to pursue, but they can't exist side by side.
Yeah, and also what he implies here is like you're probably not, if you're the person who wants to control everything, you're the last person who's qualified to do it.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
A part of that is someone who wants this much control probably is going to use it in a poor way, and someone who is given this amount of control, even if they don't want it, and does want to do something good with it, and doesn't want to ruin or step on individual liberties and individual freedoms, is the first one to get shot in the back of the head by someone who does want to use it to take out individualism in order for collectivism and to implement what they want.
Yeah, and the exact opposite, before you get into some of those quotes that I just thought of, is, so the opposite is someone who doesn't want it, right? And so you look at someone like George Washington. They wanted to make him king. They only had monarchy, mindset. They were cool making George Washington king. There's a lot of people who wanted to do that, and he was like, I don't want this power. He didn't really want to run for president. He didn't really want to run for re-election, and he did 2 terms. He was like, I don't want to do this. And so Smith is saying there, like, don't trust a person who says, I can do this and I want to do it. People who are very reluctant, they can obviously be corrupted, but it just doesn't really happen. It takes someone that is just like that type of figure of a George Washington type to not do that. But it's not common. But the person who wants it, definitely don't trust them.
Absolutely. All right, ready to dive into some quotes? Basically, I legit quoted the first.
Let's do it.
Like 3 pages. So just so you guys know, we're effectively going to be reading 75% of the book to you if we do all these quotes. But it was too much. He kind of has the same structure for all of these different chapters, where he does a stream of consciousness for the first few paragraphs, which is just like indispensable. You need to read it, you need to follow it, you need to highlight everything. Then he gets into a lot of the context, which is important. We're not going to go through all that today because we don't want to just do a read along here. We want to give you to how this applies today. And then at the end, he kind of summarizes with some big ideas, and especially launches you into the next chapter. So the way he sets this up is awesome. So to get into it, he starts out, quote, "The common features of all collectivist systems may be described in a phrase ever dear to socialists of all schools as the deliberate organization of the labors of society for a definite social goal. That our present society lacks such conscious direction toward a single aim, that its activities are guided by the whims and fancies of irresponsible individuals, has always been one of the main complaints of its social critics." That's what you talked about before. It's like, there's no plan here. Like, how does this work? Like, this goes directly against planning. And, he dove into the last chapter as to how that's not the case. It's just a bunch of people with their own individual plan, pursuing their individual goals and aims that, makes a more cohesive plan that builds an economy, this kind of independent organism. And most socialists believe that shouldn't be the case. So continue. In many ways, this puts the basic issue very clearly, and it directs us at once to the point where the conflict arises between individual freedom and collectivism. The various kinds of collectivism, communism, fascism, etc., differ among themselves in the nature of the goal toward which they want to direct the efforts of society. But they all differ from liberalism and individualism in wanting to organize the whole society and its resources for the unitary end, and refusing to recognize autonomous spheres in which the ends of individuals are supreme. In short, they are totalitarian in the true sense of this new word back then, which we adopted to describe the unexpected and nevertheless inseparable manifestations of what in theory we call collectivism.
Yep. And one thing that I would add there to kind of help people wrap their mind around exactly what he's describing there. The way I envision this is, so one of the things he discusses in the previous chapter is that collectivism is an ideology that has all these different species, and socialism is one species of collectivism. He says it's probably the most important one. But all of anything that is collectivist, fascist, whatever, Nazism, communism, whatever, these are all collectivists. Anything that's like this is going to have the same, basically the same common features. And so what he's describing here, whenever he says it directs us at once to the point where conflict arises between individual freedom and collectivism. The various kinds of collectivism, communism, fascism, etc., differ between themselves in the nature of the goal towards they want to direct the efforts of society. So the way I visualize this, so there was this movie that I didn't watch it, but the trailer gives the premise pretty well. It's called it was called Mortal Instruments or something like that. It was with Peter Jackson made it where the cities are all moving.
Yeah,
like
I've watched
these cities are like on wheels and stuff. Okay, so the point is that he's saying that whenever you have a collectivist ideology like this that is trying to direct society, that you might have, so Nazis are trying to do something different than socialists, right? He's saying their goals are probably different, but the thing that they are constructing to achieve those goals is all the same. You're putting the entire civilization on this giant mobile city and saying, we're going to drive it. Now, Nazis might want to drive it over there. Socialists might want to drive it over here. But either way, you have this one group that is steering all of society and guiding them with their plan. And liberalism, he's saying all of those things are different than liberalism. Liberalism says, I'm not going to tell you where to go. You go where you want to go. I'm not trying to drive the city. I'm not trying to drive your life. I'm just trying to protect the boundaries of the city and make it where you can drive your own life. But he's saying that they will all do the same thing, where they will build a system where everyone has to be coerced. And this is the thing that I really want to get into that he talks about here in a minute, where it's like, you can't do that. You're not going to get consensus. So it's going to require coercion. And so all of these things, socialism, doesn't matter how benevolent, doesn't matter how well-intentioned Bernie Sanders is, he's still building that giant apparatus that someone else can take control of, that's going to require coercion to direct all of our lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this a little bit too in previous chapters that, socialists hate the communists hate the socialists, but they both really, really hate the liberals. So it's like,
yep.
I'm a Packer fan. I want my daughter to date another Packer fan, but sometimes she might date a Bears fan. But what's worse than that is if she dated a soccer fan. Like, it's just the worst of all worlds, and it's not compatible, right? So, it's important to understand.
I have it on good authority that's I'll say that football is gay. I don't know if you saw that article.
Yes, I did.
The article
about the video. Yes.
Sorry.
It's also lesbian and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought.
No. If Hayek were around today, I'm sure that'd be a chapter. But yeah, I mean, so the whole point there is that these two claim to hate each other, but they hate you more than they hate each other. So I think it's important to understand how they're related to each other. But to go on to the next quote, it's going to go a bit more into this quote. The social goal or common purpose for which society is to be organized is usually vaguely described as a common good, the general welfare, or the general interest. It does not need much reflection to see that these terms have no sufficiently definite meaning to determine a particular course of action. We see this a lot with how vague some definitions are, right? A hot topic right now is CRT and some of this more diversity training type stuff. It's very vaguely defined, and there's always this gotcha moment when someone rails against CRT and the other person says, well, you don't know how to define it. Well, that's a feature, not a bug, right? You want to remain vague so you can kind of wiggle around and make sure that you can find whatever is most attractive to the person you're trying to convince. You say, it's not this thing, what everyone else said it was, but it's going to be this thing. And we're going to get into more of how, it's when people don't agree on something, you can just kind of label it something else, label it the common good or the general welfare, the general interest, like all these, really point toward, you might not agree about what it really is, but here's kind of a platitude we can push on you that will sound nice. It'll be a good bumper sticker slogan as opposed to kind of explaining to you the real thing.
Yep. Yeah. If you Google like this policy helps all of us. So I just did that. So you have stuff from the FDA, the EPA, you have stuff on COVID, America's place in the world, the American Jobs Plan, human rights and democracy, stuff about education, stuff about race. And so like what they'll do, and Hayek has this quote later where he says, I probably should have had that right here. Okay. He says the goal of planning will have been described by some such term as common welfare, which only conceals the absence of real agreement on the ends of planning. And so like the point is that they'll use these terms like common good, common welfare, or the greater good, because one, there's no definition there. What the hell does that mean? Right? What if my common good is like, I don't like this other race, I think it's common good to get rid of them. That was certainly Hitler's goal, right? So the common good doesn't mean anything. It's a platitude on its face, but it sounds good. And the other thing, what it makes me think of is like whenever your parents say, just trust me, I know better because I said so, or whatever, like it's for your own good. And maybe that's right, maybe, but sometimes it's just a dismissal to get them to shut up. And I heard this, I was telling you before we started that, so Dave Rubin interviewed Donald Trump the other day, and normally Trump interviews are him kind of saying the same things. And so, I wasn't really expecting there to be anything new there. But one thing that Trump said that I really liked was he said, look at all of the policies being put forth by the Democrats. He said, these are not 50% issues. These are not 50-50. These aren't even close. And so one of the reasons why they use these vague terms is because they will not get agreement from people otherwise. So it makes it so there's no guardrails on the power they're trying to seek, because what does it even mean? As soon as you give someone total authority to pursue the common good or the common welfare, well, there's no end point to that. It's like they can do whatever they want. They just come up with new things that are the common good. But the other thing is that they don't have to tell you what they're wanting to do. They're just saying, trust us. And the other thing that made me think of that I wrote is like, maybe one way we would map that onto today is blank is a human right. So you don't say common good, but this is a human right. Healthcare is a human right. Housing is a human right. Having sex, 5 times a week is a human right, guys, and so like, or whatever it is they're trying to say. And so I was mentioning like Bernie Sanders, where he'll have these tweets where he's like, call me crazy. Maybe I'm a radical. It's a radical idea to think that you should have your teeth when you're 90 or something like that. They just lay these things out that they say that the government should be involved in. And it's like, if people think about the implications of it, no, the government shouldn't be involved in it. But anyway, the point is they'll use these vague terms because it's a good way to get people to agree to stuff that maybe they don't agree with. Who's going to argue with the common good? Who's going to argue with anti-racism?
I hate the common good.
Right. Yeah. Who's going to argue with anti-racism or justice or, anything like that?
But that's a double-edged sword is you get to advertise that, right? That's your bumper sticker slogan. And then you also get to malign the other side by saying they don't want that,
Yep.
I, as a conservative, don't want these policies, but I like the common good. I want everyone. I want all ships to raise, because in the end, that actually helps me. That benefits me. But if I don't agree with their policies, just say, well, no, you just want to benefit the rich or white people or white cis men or something like that. So it's an attack and a defense.
There's, and there's probably something to again, kind of deviate to the anarchist I've been listening to lately. There is something to be said to have the stones to say, I don't want the common good. And here's why. I don't know what that means. Your version of that is different than my version of it. So we should not advocate for this, because as far as I know, we haven't polled every single person to ask them. And so for you to say, I'm doing this for the common good, it's like, oh, really? Did you ask everybody? Because you just asked me and I said, I don't agree. So how many other people are there like me? So it doesn't sound like it's how common is it? Like, what are the percentages? And let's say it's 45%. In what world does 45% have the right to declare what's the common good for the other 55%? Or vice versa? What if it's 60%? In what world do they have to declare that for the other 40%? And so, like, I do think there's an argument to be made where it's like, no, I don't think there is a common good. I don't think this is a human right. Who defines what a right is, and who pays for that right? So, I mean, there is something to be said there, but again, like you said, it's a double-edged sword that's used to malign people, and it takes some serious, chutzpah to say, no, I don't want that, because I think it's actually immoral for me to declare that I could even have the knowledge to know what that is. And I don't believe you that you have consensus, because, John Stuart Mill, all but one, maybe everyone else agrees. I don't. So you guys do what you want for your common good, but you're looping me into it. That's the example I give of, like, if you want to piss in your own pool, fine, but stop pissing in my pool with these policies.
Yeah. So actually later in this chapter, common good pops up again, but it goes more into what you said. Is it ties it to agreement yep. on large amounts of people, and how they agree that, oh, this general thing must be improved. But once they explain the ends, it's like, oh, no, that's not what I want. And that's when they must force agreement. So actually it pops back in later. But so the next part, he kind of goes on how although these people, these planners want to say, I'm going to improve everyone's lives, it's impossible for a central planner to account for everyone's ends, right? Everyone's main goals in the end. And so, this is where that contradiction lies, and where any form of collectivism needs to move the obstruction of individualism in order to meet its ends. So he dives into that a little bit here. Quote, the welfare and happiness of millions cannot be measured on a single scale of less and more. The welfare of a people, like the happiness of a man, depends on a great many things that can be provided in an infinite variety of combinations. It cannot be adequately expressed as a single end, but only as a hierarchy of ends, a comprehensive scale of values in which every need of every person is given its place. I love the hierarchy of ends. I think that's a brilliant way to put that. To continue to direct all our activities according to a single plan presupposes that every one of our needs is given its rank in an order of values, which must be complete enough to make it possible to decide among all different courses which the planner has to choose. It presupposes, in short, the existence of a complete ethical code in which all different human values are allotted their due place. So, like we said, it presupposes that everyone's value structure is the same. And it gets into this, ethical code idea in a little bit here. But it means a central planner is either assumed to kind of know everyone's goals here, or they are, which in reality, they are projecting their own ends onto everyone else. And that's where the coercion comes in. That's where individualism becomes an obstacle for this collective good, their collective ends.
Yeah. So, there's so much there. So one of the things there that is really good is he is saying that, look, if you're going to plan and direct, you have to, in order to do this ethically, right, which we'll get into the fact you can't do it ethically, so you have to do another thing unethically. In order to do that, you have to know the hierarchy of values of every individual person involved and have rank ordered them. And this is... I didn't plan this, but it brought it up, and so it made sense. So Michael Malice, again, in his book, The New Right, he talks about orders of values of politicians. Yeah, I think he calls it like the Neapolitan principle or something like that with ice cream. So he says, look, let's say someone says, I love freedom. I love liberty. That's like easily one of my top 5 favorite values. Like, in terms of all the values I have, liberty and freedom is a top 5 value of mine. Like, come on, guys. Like, that sounds good. But the problem is that you're going to always be, you have to, I'm not trying to paint like some kind of false dichotomy or false choice, but there are times when you have to pick what's the ascendant value. Like, look, we're either going left or we're going right. And so you have to pick one. And so he says, look, let's say you have 5 flavors of ice cream that are your favorite. I had to write this down so I could do the math on the fly. But so, and in any given situation where you could pick ice cream, you have your top 5 favorite flavors. And let's say liberty is your 5th favorite value. Neapolitan's your 5th favorite flavor of ice cream if you're a lunatic. But so he says, look, you'll pick your first one probably 55% of the time or whatever. I just came up with these numbers off the fly, but so you'll probably pick it a little over half. It's your number 1 favorite flavor. Of course, you're gonna pick it over half. Your second one, you might pick 25% of the time, right? It's your second favorite flavor. So that puts you're now at 80% of the interactions you're picking between your first and second, right? And then let's say you pick your 3rd favorite flavor 8% and your 4th favorite flavor like another 8% of the time, or maybe a 7% of the time, something like that. That makes it where you pick your 5th favorite flavor when given the choice 5% of the time or less, maybe even less. And so the point is that if you have liberty as your 5th favorite value, you're going to pick liberty almost never over whatever these other things are. And so that's how it works with any of these hierarchies. And so what Hayek is saying here is, like, in order to assume that you can do this, you have to rank order every single person's values, every single one of the things that they care about the most, and assume that you can somehow synthesize that with an entire population and come up with something, like, assuming it's not a population of clones, right? And, and even if you watch movies where they clone people, like what Multiplicity with Michael Keaton, like, one guy likes pizza a lot, one guy likes, doing these other things. So the point is that it's not going to work. You're going to have people that are like, no one's picking my favorite flavor. No one's picking my favorite value.
And that's the point.
You can't do it.
Yeah. And that's the point, is even if we had the infrastructure set up to accurately survey every single American and compile that information, because most of the problem would be to actually get information from everyone. it still doesn't matter. It's going to be such a diverse selection of priorities that you cannot satisfy everyone or even most people in that case.
Yeah.
And then that centralized authority also gets their say, which normally pulls something up, maybe that thing you like 20% of the time, they kind of think that you should favor, that you ought to do that for the collective, right? So they're going to pull that value up, right? So, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Even if you had the infrastructure to compile all this data, it still wouldn't work.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, I think it was in a few Ember episodes ago that I think James Darien brought that up. James Darien, Commutation Construct, smart guy. People should check him out. And he brought up about how the more broad, like the more a certain thing is trying to direct, the more people are involved basically in a certain thing, the more vague you have to make it. Like the more specific the goals are, the more likely there people are going to be like, no, like I don't want cheese on that, or whatever. And so it has to be vague. Like it has to be very loose, very broad if you're trying to make it where people can pursue their own ends. And so you take a country like the United States, 340 million people plus illegal immigrants. So, 400 million. I don't know if it's that many, but anyway, you know what I mean? People have been saying 19 million legal immigrants for like 30 years. I'm like, do we think it's that static? Is it that static? Anyway, but you get my point. Like you have that many people, like you're going to get like 6% of the population. Their number one value is something that is bizarre. It makes no sense. Like have you seen that movie Airheads with like Brendan Fraser and I think Pauly Shore in it? Right. And so they're making their list of demands. And like, we just came up with a bunch of crazy stuff.
Sandler?
So maybe, Adam Sandler's in it, like a football helmet filled with cottage cheese, naked pictures of B. Arthur. Like they're coming with these crazy demands. Like you're going to get people who really believe that. Like, they're like, no, I really want that, And so there is so much diversity, and that's what's beautiful about humanity, but there's so much diversity, and you're going to get a decent chunk of the population that their values are malevolent. They're gonna be like, yeah, I don't like Jews, or I don't like Catholics, or I don't like Christian, or whatever. I don't like atheists, if you're Westboro Baptist, I don't like gays. So how do you even do that? How do you incorporate that in there? And so Hayek is saying, like, look, all of this presupposes what he calls like some agreed upon ethical code, a total ethical code, in order to do this. And, we talked about this before, and I think you had a good point about it. But, I think that we do have an ethical code. We've had that, especially at this time when it was written, and laws are based on ethical codes. The fact that I can't go to your house and go to your front porch and, slaughter your dog, on your front porch, like that's an ethical code that we've agreed upon as a society. And so we do have that, but he's talking about, it seems like what you talked about was like ought. Like what ought someone be trying to pursue, or what ought someone
we share
be wanting.
Share similar ethical codes, but we do it for very different reasons, and that does make sense. And that I don't think I should go over there and I don't think I should be racist, not because I think society has must not be racist. I don't believe I should be racist because we're all made in God's image. That's my brother. I'd be violating God if I were racist. That's why I don't believe it. But other people who are, atheists also believe not be racist, just for different things. So, I do think there's some wiggle room in there. Before I go on, all I was thinking about when you're doing your math on your ice cream thing was the SNL Norm Macdonald pie chart sketch that I'm not even going to repeat it here, but if you haven't seen that, people just look that up. It's hilarious. I was checking if your numbers are adding up, and I'm going to ask you who is doing the math for you, but
for those of you who don't like this joke, it was written by a woman. So do whatever you want with that.
So moving on.
That's the one you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You'll notice these numbers don't add up to 100.
Yeah. So to dive more into the ethical code and kind of talk about what Hayek was talking about here is, quote, the conception of a complete ethical code is unfamiliar and it requires some effort of imagination to see what it involves. We are not in the habit of thinking of moral codes as more or less complete. The fact that we are consistently choosing between different values without a social code prescribing how we ought to choose does not surprise us and does not suggest to us that our moral code is incomplete. In our society, there is neither occasion nor reason why people should develop common views about what should be done in such situations. But where all means to be used are the property of society and are to be used in the name of society according to a unitary plan, a social view about what we ought to do, what ought to be done must guide all decisions. In such a
Yep.
world, we should soon find our moral code is full of gaps. The attempt
Yep.
to direct all economic activity according to a single plan would raise innumerable questions to which the answer could be provided only by a moral rule, but to which existing morals have no answer, and where there exists no agreed view on what ought to be done. People will have either no definite views or conflicting views on such questions, because in a free society in which we have lived, there has been no occasion to think about them, and still less for common opinions about them. So
Yep.
this kind of goes in. So the beginning to me is, we may have some disagreements, on here, but the conception of a complete ethical code is unfamiliar, right? You and I know that murder is not ethical, therefore we should not do it, even if there was no law there to stop us
Depends
from
on
doing
who.
it. Yeah, right. But the imagination comes in with the smaller ideas. I don't like poverty. We should try to figure out a way to get rid of poverty. Your idea is to just give poor people money. My idea is to incentivize poor people to make their own money, right? So I think
Yep.
that's where the ethical code comes in a little bit, is where not when it's not so black and white, but it gets gray. And to just assume, and there's kind of this. I mean, it's just like culture. You can't see culture. It's hard to really put to describe all elements of culture in a nice, neat paragraph. But you know it when you see it. You understand. There are differences in culture and how people kind of gravitate towards one culture or another. I think that's kind of how this kind of social code goes. Like we all kind of nod if we grew up around the same place, that
Yep.
we ought not to do these things. But it's that ought statement that really informs your view on any given situation. And that's what they're talking about here, is there are
Sure.
small differences in how we view situations. A centralized power cannot have those differences. It needs to lie down in one view, and it needs to define its own one view. And just like your decisions with ice cream, it's going to be hard to take all of that information in from every individual to try to make a cohesive view on some unitary plan.
Yeah. And so I think, I agree. And I think the minutia here, I don't want to get too bogged down in this, because that's one of the things, Hayek says himself, we're not concerned here with whether the question, with whether it'd be desirable to have such a complete moral code. He's saying that we're not concerned with that. He's merely saying that we, as society has progressed, we've actually had to allow for more freedom and more people to actually do things we disagree with. And, I think he gives the example of someone in like a tribe somewhere where they were all bound by this like code that their tribe adhered to. And so someone might be like, no, I don't want to get that tattoo, or I don't want to go kill this other tribe. But it's like, you're out of the tribe if you don't. And so one of the things he's saying is like, look, maybe it'd be nice to have this. Maybe it'd be nice if we all agreed upon this, whatever hierarchy of values. All I'm saying is we don't have that. And it would be difficult to accomplish that. And that as society has progressed, we've had to, and grown, and that's the road that was abandoned, he talks about in chapter 1, is that we've actually had to loosen up on our tolerance of people doing stuff we disagree with, basically. And so it's made it where society, and I think there's, obviously pros and cons to this, but where we have to allow for people to do things that we find morally abhorrent, because we might do things that they find morally abhorrent. And so if I want the right to tell them not to do that, then I have to at least say that, well, it makes sense for them to want the right to tell me not to do that. So we have to live in an agree to disagree kind of world. That's my right to wave my fist ends where your face begins kind of thing, John Stuart Mill. And so like the point isn't whether or not this exists. And again, he gets into this hierarchy of values kind of thing that I mentioned earlier. It's that it's not possible. It's not possible. And because it's not possible, this is where you get into this thing where, the note I wrote was consensus versus coercion. As long as that we are in a system where we cannot achieve some kind of consensus, because, okay, maybe it'd be nice to have that. Okay. But we don't. So let's move on, kind of thing is what Hayek is saying here. And so if we don't, then we have to be in some kind of system where we don't, the only times where we get consensus is when there is an agreed upon goal by a bunch of individuals. So it's not actually a collective acting. It's a bunch of individuals who all happen to have an alignment of goals. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he gets into there. He's like, look, there have been times, because he shifts from this thing here to, look, there have been times when a bunch of individuals banded together in agreement for what could be described as a common goal. But the goal itself wasn't an end. It was usually a means. So you have 100 people in a room and they say, yeah, I agree on X, but they see X as a means for each of those 100 people to all accomplish a different thing. It's like a highway or something like that, where it's like, yeah, I like the highway. I want to get on the highway, because I can use the highway to travel to this place and you can use the highway to travel to that place. We don't have to agree upon where we're going to go. We just like the fact there's a highway. So we have all of these individual plans. We agree on the means to get there. And as long as you have a system that allows for that, that's great. You don't, and he contrasts that with one where someone is saying, and I think you talk about this, I might be getting a little ahead of myself if I am, tell me to shut up, but where he talks about going on a trip and stuff, and how, you can't, they're all agreeing on something, but it turns out that no one actually decided where. They all had different destinations in mind. But anyway, we can get to that here in a minute. But the point is that this is a thing where, as long as we don't have an agreed upon hierarchy of values for the entire society, people will be left behind. You're not going to have consensus. And if you don't have consensus, but you're still wanting to go there anyway, you have to use this thing called coercion. That's the main point. That's the thing. People, I hope that if they get that, this is all consensus versus coercion. Socialism and collectivism is a thing that cannot get consensus. It can't, and it won't. And as long as it doesn't, and they still want to maintain their power, they'll have to coerce those who disagree with them into compliance, into silence, into death, whatever, so they can go on their merry way.
All they got to do is send them to a re-education camp. It's not that bad.
And that's right. And I've been there, and I'll tell you what, the food wasn't half bad.
It wasn't bad. I mean, they fed you once a week, but that was my fault.
Well, that's what made it taste so good.
Right. Stale bread. I think it was all pumpernickel, or there was a little.
Pumpernickel's not bad, actually. I think pumpernickel and rye is, I don't know if I've actually had a Reuben on pumpernickel. I might be getting confused here. Anyway, I might have skipped way ahead in the notes there. But actually, I want to transition to that next part there, you know?
Yeah. No, so you actually hit on something that was pretty good. Your road analogy actually comes into this next paragraph here, but I love the way he uses it here as well. But this is where he gets into the all-inclusive scale of values. So, you have this moral ethical code, which kind of gives you what you ought to do. But then there's also the scale of values in which, we all have different needs, and those needs change. So if you have one central entity determining what are the needs of the people, that kind of builds a scale of values as to what should we prioritize first, just what is going to be the highest priority in general. And even that you cannot properly scale for the whole proportion of the country. It's just impossible to do that. Normally one's got to take precedent. It's normally going to be at the expense of the others. Because like I think we mentioned in the last episode, a true free market economy is not a zero-sum game, but once a central entity takes part of that economy and production is no longer the goal of the economy, producing more value, it becomes a zero-sum game. And that is where you need to build a scale of values in order to prioritize something normally at the expense of another.
100%.
So he gets into a quote: "Not only do we not possess such an all-inclusive scale of values, it would be impossible for any mind to comprehend the infinite variety of needs of different people which compete for the available resources and attach a definite weight to each." Talk about scale of values. So they're scaling it. They're adding a weight effectively to all the needs.
Definite weight is another way of saying an agreed upon metric. Like, it's definite. Everyone agrees this is the value, and it's this valuable. No one wants it more, no one wants it less. Go on.
For sure. For our problem, it is of minor importance whether the ends of which any person cares comprehend only his own individual needs, or whether they include the needs of his closer, even those his more distant fellows. That is, whether he is egotistic or altruistic in the ordinary sense of these words. The point which is so important is the basic fact that it is impossible for any man to survey more than a limited field, to be aware of the urgency of more than a limited number of needs. So it's kind of what we talked about before. It's impossible for one person. I mean, they kind of personify,
or even a small group
person, and And I mean, that's going to be kind of the democratic socialist talking points. Well, it's not just one person.
Yeah.
It's a democracy, right? And that's, we're going to get into that
Democratic
later, is
socialism. We'll
how
get into
that
that.
is
Yeah.
complete BS.
I'm going to go on a freaking tirade on that later.
So to continue, whether his interests center around his own physical needs or whether he takes a warm interest in the welfare of every human being he knows, the ends about which he can be concerned will always be only an infinitesimal fraction of of the needs of all men. So again, it doesn't matter how good of heart you are. It doesn't matter if Mother Teresa herself is running this thing. It's impossible to account for all of those needs.
Yep.
This is a fundamental fact on which the whole philosophy of individualism is based. It does not assume, as is often asserted, that man is egotistic or selfish or ought to be. And I think some Ayn Randians might have some contradictions there, but it merely starts from the indisputable fact that the limits of our powers of imagination make it possible to include in our scale of values more than a sector of the needs of the whole society, and that since, strictly speaking, scales of value can exist only in individual minds, nothing but particular scales of values exist, scales which are inevitably different and often inconsistent with each other. It's kind of what we talked about again last episode, where a free market is so useful not only because of its efficiency and effectiveness, but also it's the only way to order all of these different needs without coercion, right? It is all of these different inputs that no government, no central body can possibly take in, but we can do via free exchange without a centralized power governing. So to finish this quote, from this, the individualist concludes that individuals should be allowed within defined limits to follow their own values and preferences rather than somebody else's, that within these spheres of individual systems of ends should be supreme and not subject to any dictation by others. It is this recognition of the individual that is the ultimate judge of his ends. The belief that as far as possible his own views ought to govern his actions, that forms the essence of the individualist position. So yeah, right there is just, I mean, he needs to define this individualist position. He's defined the individualist ethic in order to contrast it to what would have to be collectivism, what would have to go into this scale of values that is incompatible with all of these individuals with their own values and their own added weights to these values.
Yep. And I think one of the things he says there that's so important, and actually back up, one of the things you said there that was so important is that it's the reference to the last episode where it's like the free market is what makes it to where we don't need a plan. You have your plan. I have my plan. And we can do whatever we want. And that's what Hayek references, is that the liberal, in the good sense, not in the American sense, their job is like a gardener, tending a gardener, a farmer. It's like you're only trying to maintain the ecosystem in which things can thrive. You're not trying to tell the plant grow this way or whatever thing. You're just trying to cultivate the soil, maintain the ecosystem. You know, one of the thoughts I had was you can find all of these different things where it'll be like your favorite Thanksgiving sides by state. You know, which states chose green bean, or, you know, we got what's this one? Okay, we got cream corn in Kansas. That sounds right. Corn in Iowa. You know, brown gravy in Wyoming. You know, Colorado, mashed potatoes, and all this other stuff. And so
it's Miller Lite in Wisconsin.
I was going to say in Wisconsin, it looks like it's cat turds, you know? And so like whatever you're into, you can do. And so like, that's the point. That's what a free market is you can have all these states, right? And so let's say they represent a conglomerate of individuals. They can bring whatever they want to Thanksgiving, and you're going to have these disparate that right there shows the disparate values, you know? And actually the first one that came to my mind, I'm like, okay, I don't want to use this example, but I'll still tell you guys because it's funny, is there's a Reddit page called Data is Beautiful. And they have a thing like that where it's like porn searches by state. And you see which this is some dark stuff on there, literally and figuratively. But it's, you know, and so you see where the values by in different state of what those people are into or whatever changes. But that's what the free market represents. And I know you're looking about Googling it right now, Kevin. Don't do it. But anyway,
I'm deleting my search history, so I don't show up.
Oh, got it. Anyway, and so the point, but you got vaccinated, so Google already has access to it because of the microchips. I'm kidding.
NSA.
80% kidding. So anyway, but the point is that's the free market. The free market is you can bring whatever side you want, or you can do all these other things. You just create a system where people can pick the thing that they want. And I was listening to a thing, James Lindsay was talking about what the opposite of that is. And he talked about how in the Soviet Union, there was only three hats, because there's no innovation. And it was all this top-down thing. And so people were like, you get three hats. Those who are in charge, like, we don't need to come up with more hats. Here's the three hats we decided on. So that would be like, if what's your favorite side dish by state? Every single one of them is mashed potatoes, right? It's like, you only get this. We decided that, right? And so that's the contrast there. And that's where Hayek is saying these are not compatible. You will not get consensus on these things. And if you don't have consensus and you're trying to force consensus, you're just going to come up with ways to deal with those who dissent. And that is called coercion. And it's immoral.
Absolutely. And, I guess moving on to this next section, I really like what this next section brings up, because it brings up, one of like the main talking points of collectivists against, the people who advocate against it is, every single time, and Hayek was actually accused of this in a lot of the American criticism, is every single time you say centralized planning is wrong, you're accused of saying, okay, every type of planning is socialism, right? Every type of planning is communism. And the right falls into this a lot. They refer everything is socialism. They can just say, well, this is just a meaningless word, kind of how the left uses racist, that turns into a meaningless word. But this kind of disarms them by saying, like, they're the crazy conspiracy theorists who think everything is socialism. Like, we don't want full control. We just need to help people in the small sector. And, it won't be any big deal. We get to keep your free markets. You get to keep all your fun little toys you get, from free enterprise, from your capitalist system. But there is a way for them to take control of a very small element that indirectly controls everything else. And this is kind of what he elaborates on here. And he uses a good, example of Germany. So, quote, we can rely on voluntary agreement to guide the action of the state only so long as it is confined in spheres where agreement exists. Also where he starts to bring up agreement, which is a huge theme for the rest of this chapter.
Oh, yeah.
But not only when the state undertakes direct control in fields where there is no such agreement is bound to suppress individual freedom. We can unfortunately not indefinitely extend the sphere of common action and still leave the individual free in his own sphere. Once the communal sector, in which the state controls all the means, exceeds a certain proportion of the whole, the effects of its actions dominate the whole system. Although the state controls directly the use of only a large part of the available resources, the effects of its decisions on the remaining part of the economic system become so great that indirectly it controls almost everything. So that's the part we're talking about. Only this small little bit of control in the small sector, or he calls it, a large proportion of a small sector can control everything in there. So he uses the example here, whereas was, for example, true in Germany as early as 1928, the central and local authorities directly controlled the use of more than half the national income. This is according to a German estimate that 53% of the national income they controlled. They indirectly control the whole economic life of the nation. If you control 53%, you indirectly control everything else as well. There is then scarcely an individual end which is not dependent for its achievement on the action of the state and the social scale of values which guides the state's action must embrace practically all individual ends. So this is the part where it doesn't take full control of the means of production in order to build a planned economy. It only takes direct control of a large enough proportion of the economic resource to indirectly control the whole economy. Once this form of indirect control is established, individuals become subservient to the state as the social scale of values tips toward the state participation in all private, economic, and even social matters.
Yep. And I think you had some good examples there, of that. But before we get to that, it's kind of one of those things where if you have a company that is, we're going to get into my percentages again. This joke was written. So where if you have someone who, let's say I control 30% of a company and the next highest shareholder has 2%, right? I don't control the majority, but that all of the rest of those people are going to have to be in unanimous agreement to oppose me on certain things. And so when he gives the example of Germany controlling, what was it, 53% of the economy, something like that. Like if you control that much, everyone's going to have to run stuff by you, right? Like you've got your fingers in all the pots. And so you don't have to control everything in order to influence everything, in order to be the gatekeeper of policy on everything, right? I mean, if you look at government spending, I probably should have Googled this while you're talking instead of just like thinking about it out loud right now, but what is the US government spending in terms of GDP? US government spending as percent GDP. I'm not going to use COVID, so we're going to go let's do 2019. So the US government spending for GDP was about 36% in 2019. That's a huge chunk of the economy. That's only 16% less than what was going on in Germany and what he's talking about there. And if you look at where it's at now, I bet you it's probably more than that. It's approaching 40%. I mean, shit, man, look at all the trillions they spent to do nothing but drive up inflation. Don't want to get into it. But the point is that that's so much money. That's so much money. In terms of the employers, I think the largest single employer of people in the United States is the government. The second largest, because I know that there's a distinction, Walmart is the biggest non-government employer of citizens in the U.S. Because I know that is Walmart, but I think the biggest employer of people in the U.S. is the government. People can fact check me on this, but I don't think I'm wrong, because you're looking at teachers and all this other stuff. And so that's huge. That's the point that he's making there, is they don't have to control everything. So this idea that like socialism means you have to control everything, well, it leads to that, but it's not like it jumps from 10% to 95%. It incrementally goes up. And if you looked at that same GDP chart over the years, my guess is you'd see it doing this. You'd see it doing this. And so it's an incremental thing, which again goes back to the thing. I've been every single episode, and I know this will be the thing. I fight to go to like the conclusion about incrementalism. But that's the point of what is happening here, is that it happens incrementally. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about, there's this common, they always want, when I say they, I mean leftists, they always want to claim that, communism and the Soviet Union is bad-ish. But, Germany was practicing, a right-wing ideology. It wasn't socialism. It's like, okay, does 53% of the national income not seem like socialism when they control that? Also, when it comes to like, we see this expansion of direct control economically in the United States via the Federal Reserve and student loans. They control so much. I mean, almost every single person, around in our generation's got a job is controlled somewhat by student loans. Federal student loans more specifically, but also there's social controls in fields where there's divided agreements. Like a big one, I think, of gun control, and they go back to Germany and their claim, the right wing claim in America right now is look who implemented gun control. Like Germany implemented gun control, and the refute that I keep hearing, especially among people like on YouTube, which I think is hilarious, is they didn't implement full gun control. They just took it away from the Jews. And I'm like, oh, okay, well that makes sense. I guess that's not any sort of gun control we should recognize.
That's fine.
Yeah, right. That didn't.
And what was the group they targeted again?
Yeah, I don't know. I think German African Americans, is that a thing? I don't know.
That's right. Yeah, there's like millions of them.
Yeah, African Americans. Yeah, but my point is that you see this type of social control in small areas where there's no agreement. Gun control is one of them. There's not a huge consensus on gun control, even though a lot of media outlets want to say there is. Anti-discrimination policy, not a huge percentage of people actually agreeing with the policy there. And then something that I think we're probably going to see controlled more in the future is something like religious freedom and religious liberty that you see with the Masterpiece Cake Shop kind of thing, where Colorado keeps going after that guy. I think we're seeing them control just enough of these social spheres where there's not enough agreement that they know that once they get the influence in those spheres, it's like public education, yeah, okay, it's your thing. You educate your children, you figure out what's best for them, but we own the public schooling system. So now we own a pretty good chunk of that. The only way you can get out of that is homeschooling your kids, right? The only way is to leave it completely. So, this idea of or the rebuttal of saying we don't want full control of the means of production. We just want, you know, enough of it that we can control what we don't control. Right. That's
Yep.
kind of the line there.
Taylor, I'm going to let you get back to your acceptance speech here in a minute, but I want to, Beyonce had the greatest music video. So I want to talk about the thing I just said here about the GDP for government spending, because I was actually wrong. And I want to actually, I'm okay correcting in real time. Are you cool with that really fast? Because this is actually scary as shit. Oh. So this is going to sound crazy, but actually GDP, US or government spending as part of percentage of the GDP declined rapidly starting in 2016. 2016, 2017, 2018 went real down. 2019, that 36% number I gave represents like an enormous low over the last 50 years. That
fascist Nazi as president that we had during that time, that is just
Nazi.
following the path of Hitler, you know.
Right. Yeah. In 1971, it was about 35%, it looks like. So actually, here's what it does: is it goes like this, and then it goes like this, and then during the Reagan years, it kind of goes up and does this. Because I mean, that book, The Age of Entitlement, I've referenced before, he absolutely talks about how Reagan blew out spending. He was not some fiscal conservative, you know, and for him to be hoisted up as like the thing for conservatives to mimic, I think is ludicrous, at least when it comes to spending. And so I think that's actually a pretty valid argument. And then at the beginning of the 90s, it starts to go up, and then it starts going down again because the Republicans in the House and the Senate actually forced Clinton to balance the budget. So fair enough. It drops down to this crazy low 35% in 2000. Goes up in 2010. It hits about 39%. That's the high. Or actually, no, that looks closer to maybe 42. In 2020, government spending as part of the US GDP was 44% of our economy in 2020. And understand that they want to spend more. What was that bullshit infrastructure plan? Everything's infrastructure, you know, the common good. They want to spend more. And so I'm only saying this not just to say, well, hey, I was wrong about this. Yeah, it goes like this. But is that they control more than what I even thought. I was like, oh, 36%. That's crazy. Yeah, 44% last year. And this year, it's going to be even more. I bet you it goes up to 46, 47%. I'm sorry, what was Germany? At
53.
53? Yeah. How far away from that are we? And I'm not saying that like, oh, this percentage equals Nazism. Just saying, like you said, and what we have been saying is that the point is that when the government controls, again, TLDR, here's the Cliff Notes. When the government controls a huge chunk of the economy, they control the economy. That's the point, right? You have 4 seats in a car. Someone only needs to sit in one of those to steer the whole car. That's the driver's seat. So you don't have to control all of those seats. You don't have to control the whole economy in order for you to be what's effectively in charge of the economy. And that's everyone's lives. You have to think about what does the government think about this before you make any of these decisions, right? And so that's the point that I'm trying to make. That's the point, that when it's that big, it effectively controls everything.
Yeah,
it effectively controls everything. Sorry to deviate.
No. Hitler's Germany did not start overnight, and it didn't even start. Correct. It didn't even start with him necessarily.
Yep.
We need to understand the trends that these tyrannical countries, these tyrannical governments have gone to get there. And this is Hayek's whole point of this book, is to say England was like, oh, we're not going to turn into Germany. Like, we're not even close to that. It's like, okay, look at where we're at right now compared to Germany was 30 years ago. And now even you bringing up those statistics is like, okay, people should probably take note of the projection in which we're going on. And you find this kind of, this catalyst that, has a drastic increase in tyranny or totalitarianism, and a drastic decrease in individual freedom. You could say something like COVID, although a serious crisis, seems to be a crisis that hasn't gone to waste. I don't know if that 44% number that you cited in 2020, it's scary. You can always say, well, that's because of COVID. Well, are we going to say that in 10 years when that number kind of stays there or goes up because they're using that as an opportunity?
2009, it was close.
Yeah.
In 2009, it was closed from the housing thing that they also created. And that's the point that you're making there. It's that they will find a thing. It won't go to waste. Like you just said, it won't go. I mean, that's the Rahm Emanuel quote. It won't go to waste.
Yeah.
They will come up with anything. And by the way, before COVID, what were they saying? Climate, right?
Yeah.
Climate, race, all these things, and so they will find any excuse that they can. Plastic straws, pick something. And so they will find any excuse to consolidate power, any threat. That's the analogies of war that they will use to consolidate that. And there's no guardrails on it. There's no guardrails on it. I'm done.
Yeah, that was perfect. So this next section actually starts to tie things in together. It goes to the common welfare, but also talks more about agreement and how there must be forced agreement when they find out that there's no way that they're going to be agreeing on the ends of all these things. So
Which quote are you looking at here?
How
does it start?
It is not difficult to see.
Okay, yeah, I'll read that, man. Like you've read all these quotes, man. I'll read it. It is not difficult to see what must be the consequences when democracy embarks upon a course of planning, which in its execution requires more agreement than in fact exists. The people may have agreed upon adopting a system of direct economy because they have been convinced that it will produce great prosperity. In the discussions leading to the decision, the goal of planning will have been described by such term as common welfare, which only conceals the absence of real agreement on the ends of planning, as mentioned earlier. Agreement will in fact exist only on the mechanism to be used. So the mechanism being planning, gaining that control. But it is a mechanism which can be used only for a common end. And the question of the precise goal toward which all activity is to be directed will arise as soon as the executive power has to translate the demand for a single plan into a particular plan. So there's a difference. We need a plan is very different than here's the plan. Then it will appear that the agreement on the desirability of planning is not supported by agreement on the ends the plan is to serve. Where are we going, guys? The effect of the people's agreeing that there must be central planning without agreeing on the ends will be rather as if a group of people were to commit themselves to take a journey together without agreeing where they want to go, with the result that they may all have to make a journey which most of them do not want at all. That planning creates a situation in which it is necessary for us to agree on a much larger number of topics than we've been used to, namely everything in most of these cases. And that in a planned system, we cannot confine collective action to the tasks on which we can agree, but are forced to produce agreement. So produce manufacture agreement, Noam Chomsky, manufacturer consent, anyway, on everything in order that any action can be taken at all is one of the features which contributes more than most to determining the character of a planned system. So when he talks about character he's saying what it's like, and the fact that you can't, again, consensus versus coercion. The character is you can't get consensus. You won't. This is the argument we've been trying to build. So to recap for the folks at home, you have to pick, right? People get to plan their own lives and you just let them free, let them loose to do that. Or you have these philosopher kings or whoever telling people how to do it, right? Telling them how to do it. And what Hayek is saying is you won't get consensus. You might get all these people saying we want to plan. That's again, we want to go on a trip. We want to go on a vacation. And then you get there and some people were like, well, I want to go to the beach and I want to go here and I want to go here. And it's like, well, we're all at the gulag. So I guess at least let's take some photos and enjoy the stay. But anyway, but the point is that like you can't get consensus. And in the absence of consensus, you have to do one of two things. And so and we'll talk about this later. We can transition there if we want, whatever. But you have to do one of two things. You have to relinquish the power and give the autonomy back to the people. Or you have to use coercion to make sure that that you have to silence the dissidents, right? That's what coercion is. And I mentioned Noam Chomsky, that manufacturing consent, but the point is you have to use propaganda. Hayek talks about the use of propaganda. One of the chapters later is called The End of Truth. Talk about prescience, right, guys? Fake news much. And so, but the point is that you're going to have to use means that are unethical, that are evil. And that's why he says most socialists wouldn't agree to this if they saw what they'd have to do in order to get people on board with your plan, or you have to give the power back, which you're not going to do. And I mean, the stuff where he talks about that here and the quotes from that Dunmore committee and stuff about like, well, if we lose an election, we got to make sure that you don't, actually do the will of the people, who voted us out of power.
Stop our progress.
Is very prescient. Yeah, that's right. Stop our progress that the people don't want is very prescient for today. So anyway, I don't know what you want to do with that.
Yeah. I mean, I love, again, the way that he implements again, the theme of collective welfare back into here, because, that's a term that's only implemented when there is no general consensus or agreement on a policy or collective action. And to me, it reminds me a lot of the phrase that I kind of hate is common sense. Common sense is implemented only when the sense of things is not common to most people. If it were common sense, you don't have to say it's common sense. It would be common sense, right? Common welfare is a statement that you don't have to use normally, because people are like, okay, yeah, I know murder is a bad thing because, I prefer not to get murdered, or feel like I'm always at the risk of getting murdered. It's common sense. It's common welfare. Like, we don't do these things. But when someone has to state like, oh no, if you don't agree with this, it's for the common welfare. It's for all these different things. That is a way of sidestepping the agreement part and just saying this is for the general good of society. And, we're either going to say you have to agree with this, and if you don't agree with this, we're just going to claim that you're against common welfare. And then, there's also, a large space of agreement where we can agree on general circumstances that must be improved. You think about racial disparities, income inequality, but proposed policies to fix those inequities don't tend to garner much popular agreement, especially when those policies require more centralized power, resulting in less individual freedom. But again, if you say, I don't want to do this type of redistribution of income, you're claimed to hate the poor and love the rich, right? That's always the claim there. So they really use that right as an attack, which I believe he brought up in an earlier chapter as well. But where we can agree on a centralized authority can improve the situation, we rarely agree on the ends of that situation. So when a power authority wants to implement, something big. So an example of this is if we generally agree, which I think we all generally agree on, that we should take care of the environment. It's beneficial to everyone to take care of the environment. We agree on that central idea. But when they implement a policy, let's say the Green New Deal, that forces us to agree on the actual ends, exactly how we're going to protect the economy at any cost. And now a lot of us don't agree with that. And they're like, well, if this is implemented, we're going to force that you agree with it, because if you don't agree with it, we're going to fine you. We're going to do it. We're going to jail you. There's all these different things we can do to you, because the centralized authority now has the power to do those things. They have the power to coerce. They have the power to produce agreement by force.
Yeah, and that's the point, and what we'll get to here, or maybe it's a good time to get there. One of the things. So today, whenever I was working and I was thinking about this, I texted you because I was like, it's faster to just text Kevin than to write this down in the Google Doc. But I said decreased probability of agreement leads to increased necessity of coercion. And again, this is one of those things. I know this is redundant, but I'm okay with it, because there's a few central themes to this book. And one of them, again, is what Hayek, he wrote a thing later on called the fatal conceit. And the fatal conceit of socialism is that you will not get consensus. And since you don't have consensus, you'll have to use coercion. And understand that coercion is force. It's force. It's forcing you to do these things. And the government has a monopoly on violence, on force. That is what it does. That's the quote, right? The government has a monopoly on violence. And so, like, the fact that we have to be in a situation or in a, some kind of dichotomy between choosing, the government or whoever's at the top, between giving, you've got these people who, to go back, refer to the Adam Smith quote at the beginning, where it's like, no one is more dangerous than the person who has folly enough to think that they can do this, right? So you have the person who has folly enough to think that they can do this, which mainly, and I'm just going to say it, is that the people on the left, this is what the left represents. They have the folly enough to think that they can do this. And we're seeing this play out right now with the policies. I stumbled upon this account yesterday on Twitter called Is This Infrastructure? And it's got this picture of Joe Biden. It's not like a picture. It's just like him looking confused, that's Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And so it's like the modern left is we're going to control everything. We're going to run everything, and we'll call it infrastructure, call it whatever we have to need to, but we have the folly to think that we can do this, that we're the morally enlightened. We do have agreed upon ethical code, right? And it's our ethical code, and you need to get in line and get involved and get behind us in that. And Hayek is saying you're not going to get consensus. And so you're going to have to use these means. So whenever I say coercion, they do all the things. Like, look at the bullying, the moralizing, that you mentioned earlier. It's like they will call you whatever they need to call you to get you to shut up. Understand that when they say you're racist or that you're a bigot or you don't care about these people, that is a form of coercion. They are shutting you down. They are delegitimizing your dissent in their dumbass plan, right? And so that is what we're looking at here. And this has only increased. This has only gotten worse. That's the fatal conceit, is that you have people. And by the way, I think it's fair to say that the people who are actually in charge right now, like, I think there was a time when the people who went down this road, like, think about Bernie Sanders, in the early 80s, he honeymooned to the Soviet Union. Ben Shapiro likes to make jokes about it. I think Bernie Sanders probably thought this was right and moral and good. I don't think that Bernie Sanders had a lot of malice. I think he's the person. I think he is. I'm not sure if he is now. I think he just is because he has to be at his age. But, whenever Hayek talks about the socialists that would say, I'm out, whenever they saw what their ideology creates, I think Sanders is one of them. But today, I think most of the people, they know. I think they know. And the people who are the ones who are naive about it are the ones on the ground, not the ones in charge. I have people in my mind who I'm like, they really think this would make the world a better place. They're wrong, but their heart's in the right place.
I think AOC's at that stage. I
strongly disagree on that. I so disagree. Yeah, no, I think she knows damn well exactly where all of her ideas go. Personally,
I don't know if she's mature enough or has the capacity to know at this point. And I'm trying to say this as nice as I can. And I don't think she's a complete moron, but like I always say, like if there should be a poster child for free college, she should be it, because she went to a university, got her degree, and learned nothing. So that is like the perfect example of somebody who should get free college. But agree to disagree on that one. But yes, I do generally agree that there are these true believers, the people who truly think they're doing what's right. I would say that's Bernie Sanders, or at least was Bernie Sanders. I agree with you now.
Real fast. Yeah. Hold on. My point is that I don't think that those are the people at the top anymore. The people at the top now, under whoever is in control of our government and who is in control of these things, know where this goes. They know this is coercion. And so that's why I'm saying, when you look at the language, the racial, whatever it is, and the moralizing, that's on purpose. I think that type of demagoguery and, like asserting some kind of moral high ground, authority there, I think that's on purpose. And then the people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis are mirroring what they're hearing, and they believe it. But just like the people on, who see the way that these people interact, Twitter is the play, or whatever Bridget Fettisy's analogy was. Like, this happens on both the left and the right. But my point is I think the people in charge, especially those who are using this language that's emotionally abusive to silence people, that's the coercion that Hayek is talking about. So going to mapping this onto today, yes, there are true believers, but I think that the true believers are the ones on the ground. They're not the ones at the top. The ones at the top are like, no, use these words. This is why, dude, you'll get it. This is where I have install all the apps on your phone. Install Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, NBC, NPR, and see what happens. And Huffington Post, and whenever something happens, and you'll see that their headlines for events are fucking identical. There's a reason for that. It is a form of coercion because there is not consensus on these things. And so they have to do something with dissent. You and I are dissent. So they have to bully us into dissent. So, I mean, yes, there are true believers. But the point I was trying to get at is that the true believers, I don't think, are at the top anymore. Whereas when Hayek was writing, I think a lot of them were at the top. The people in labor government, the Dunmore Committee he mentions, whoever the one guy, Alfred's, I don't know what his name is, Simon Alasky or whatever. I have it right here.
But that's
Harold
like
Lasky. He's a true
yeah,
believer.
Lasky, yeah. But yeah, so yeah, I agree with you on that. That I think I think actually Bernie Sanders is more of an aberration than anything else. I think
Sure.
more common is the Nancy Pelosi that you can tell when she's
Yep.
making excuses for things that she's just like an evil dirtbag like that.
Yeah.
Like I don't say that lightly. I don't think I don't think Bond villains really exist in the real world except for extremely rare circumstances. I actually think she could be, if she was 1,000 years younger, could be in the next Bond movie as the Bond villain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe like 1,500 years younger, but
Exactly.
but yeah, we totally agree on that point. But I think we do need to start moving through it. Like I'm going to start paraphrasing some of these quotes, just because I mean,
Probably
just
should.
one episode in this 2 hour stretch is or one chapter in this 2 hour stretch is already cutting it close. But again, like terrific. We can't do this chapter justice with how much we're covering it here. But to get to the kind of the next part, he talks about that next stage that we did talk about in a previous chapter, when going to the experts, when especially these ineffective governing bodies say, okay, we can't do this stuff efficiently enough, so we're going to have to elect this or implement this bureaucracy to kind of do the stuff that we don't want to do or don't want to be culpable for, because that'll kind of institute all of these changes that we want to make. So going to the next quote, parliaments, or really any democratic governing body, come to be regarded as ineffective talking shops, unable or incompetent to carry out the tasks for which they have been chosen. The conviction grows that if efficient planning is to be done, the direction must be taken out of politics and placed in the hands of experts, permanent officials, or independent autonomous bodies. So that is where we get into that the next step. And how many times have we heard as Americans that Congress is too lazy or they don't agree on anything?
Don't get anything done.
Yeah, but most Americans don't know that is a feature of a democratic republic with checks and balances, not a bug. And the problem is we're all like, most Americans like, no, we want to see people agreeing. We want to see bipartisanship. We all want to get this done efficiently, when that's not how the system's set up. You want to be as inefficient as possible. But when Congress or the president calls for more planning to fix an issue, but they're not willing to give up, but they are all too willing to give up their authority to a more permanent, unelected bureaucracy, that's where the experts come in. That's where the real problem begins. That's where these people who are focused on this one thing get to implement all their ideas at the expense of everything else. So all these other scale of values are going to ignore this and only implement their scale, their top value. And this is explicitly and intentionally moves democracy towards totalitarianism and moves us down the road to serfdom. A lot of the people on the left saying, "Oh, you're attacking our democracy," when they're actually meaning the exact opposite. Is no, we want to get rid of this democratic system and we want to implement this bureaucracy. I always think Department of Education as this one thing that we cannot get rid of, that is just there. And that was something that was implemented and now has full control over how we teach our kids, basically.
Yep. And so, there's a few things there. Sorry, I'm trying to think of how do we, what you just said about how it's a feature, not a bug, that our government moves so slowly. I'm not sure that could be overemphasized enough, because here's the thing. What are you saying when it's not getting anything done? Well, it's not doing anything. Well, what's the opposite of that? Is it's doing stuff. Okay. What should it be doing? As decided by who? Using what values? After speaking to who? We have a system that is designed to facilitate gridlock. Gridlock is another way of saying that it's not doing anything. And the fact that our system is designed in a way that it's like, you're not going to get consensus on most things. That's the point. The times when you can get something done is when there is consensus on most things. Like, the system we have is the opposite of what the collectivists want in what Hayek is describing, right? It is that it will only happen when there's consensus on most of these things. Gridlock is not enough people agree, so we're not going to do it. Period.
Yeah. The German government in the 1930s and 40s was very efficient at the unfortunate cost of a lot of people.
Exactly. Efficiency is a word. It's like, okay, a serial killer can be efficient, right? Efficiency just means that you are, efficient, quick, industrious, you don't expend
high quality at a high speed,
not wasteful. Yeah. High quality, high speed at what you do. It has nothing to do with the morality or necessity of what you're doing. It's just how you're doing it. And so the people who say, well, the government isn't efficient here, it's like, no, it's incredibly efficient. at creating gridlock. Gridlock is a good thing because it means what gridlock denotes is that there is not consensus here. And so one of the things that people, so let's to map this last part here onto today. So Joe Manchin in the news all the time, right? Because he's the Democrat who's like, I'm not gonna end the filibuster. And one of the things that Hayek talks about here and in other places is that, look, so to create a through line through this chapter is so planning says people doing their own thing is chaos. So we need someone or some group of enlightened whatevers telling people what to do, organizing everyone. All right. And we'll call it the common good or the common welfare, or it's human right or whatever. One of the reasons we do this, and well, first off, this presupposes that everyone agrees on everything. And then once we realize not everyone agrees on everything, in fact, everyone disagrees on most things. So it's the exact opposite. So when you get into that scenario, the odds of someone turning back is virtually zero. So they're going to have to come up with ways to deal with that dissent. That's where coercion comes in. But one of the ways that they can deal with that dissent is to make adaptations to the governing system to make it to where the dissent is irrelevant. The dissent is not represented, is another way of saying that. So Great Britain at the time, that's what Parliament was, and the United States, these are representative countries where those in charge are representative, or supposed to be, of the population. And so one of the things that I see your poster here, it got me, that Hayek gets into here is, well, how do you avoid representation? You change the governmental system. You change it. And so you make where representation is actually not part of the math. And so what do you do there? So to map this on today, you delegate to bureaucracies, unelected officials, these bureaucracies, these experts, like you mentioned earlier, Fauci or whatever. So you delegate them to bureaucracies, the decisions. So then the parliament becomes, hey, it's not us. It's not us. Again, I think I mentioned this before. EPA was created by executive order, right? How powerful is the EPA today? Pretty damn powerful. The Department of Education was, same thing. Totally immoral. This is a cabinet level position, right? How much power does the Department of Education have today over how many lives? So much power and influence, right? So he's saying, here's one of the ways that you deal with the lack of consensus is you delegate to these bureaucracies. And that's not inherently a bad thing if that bureaucracy has a goal that's stated on the outset. So he gives the example of a general in this chapter. He's like, look, the military is a bureaucracy. You have a general in a war who has a goal. Hey, we need to beat those guys. The end, right? We know what victory looks like.
Efficiency is a priority and gridlock is not. So
exactly. No, that's exactly right. Yep. No, that's a very good point, Kevin. And so the point is he's saying, look, just by giving it to bureaucracies isn't a bad thing in and of itself if there's a clearly stated goal and there's guardrails there. Okay. So with the general, it's like, yeah, no, we're all going to rally around this thing. We're going to beat these bad guys and go back to our lives. But he's saying that's not the thing that happens with these bureaucracies because he used this vague language here. And so we can circumvent the need for representation with our systems here, to go to that, the article I read before we got started, where the guy was like, hey, this applies in Great Britain and here. That what you see happening, what Hayek is talking about, the bureaucracies in Great Britain, that's here. And so that's one of the things that they do to circumvent that there. And so I don't know if you want to get into that footnote there whenever it talks about the permanence of this stuff, because this is one of the things I want to spend a little bit of time on before we end. Maybe this is the thing we end on. But about how they make it to, they don't care about democracy. They don't care about like consensus or anything like that. They just care about power and getting their shit done. And so they'll do whatever they need to do there, including like completely throwing all of the principles that, like you said, are features, not bugs, that require consensus to do things out the window. So the filibuster, like I said, Joe Manchin earlier, he's one of the Democrats. It's like, I'm not going to get rid of the filibuster, but he's mentioned now that he's open to it. We're pretty early in this administration, guys. We're pretty early. Okay. Yeah. So the odds of us moving more and more towards that, of getting rid of these types of things that kind of actually keep the tyranny of some plurality or minority at bay, Those things are being removed. And this is the thing this is one of the things, like I said at the beginning of the video, that Hayek touched on, and noticed trending in that direction in the West, I don't know, 80 years ago.
Anyway. Yeah, I mean, we're early in this administration, but how awesome is it to be Joe Biden right now? You get to wake up every morning and you're told you're president. It's news to you. So,
right. You're like, oh shit. You're like Drew Barrymore in 51st Dates.
Yeah, right. It's pretty amazing. But I think that footnote you're talking about is the Lasky footnote.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'll just introduce Lasky here, and I'm going to paraphrase a lot of what's going down here. But so the next section, he dives into the process of turning democracy into bureaucracy, and an argument made by English political theorist and Labor Party economist Professor Harold Lasky. And as we kind of search his background right before talking, big fan of communism, Marxism, all that fun stuff. So
loved it.
Yeah, super
Stalin,
influential
love
guy.
Stalin. Yeah.
AKA he's just, a Labor Party. So is what it is. But so to go to kind of the bottom of one of his quote, I'm going to go into the next paragraph as well as quote, and this is Lasky's quote: "The necessity and value of delegated legislation," which just means power given to an unelected body, delegated to a different legislature, "has recently been strongly affirmed by the Dunmore Committee, and its extension is inevitable if the process of socialization is not to be wrecked by normal methods of obstruction, i.e., checks and balances, which existing parliamentary procedure sanctions." So we already see them trying to bypass all this stuff. And then I'm just going to go into the next quote. "And to make it quite clear that the socialist government must not allow itself to be too much fettered by democratic procedure," Professor Lasky at the end of the same article raised the question whether in a period of transition to socialism, a labor government can risk the overthrow of its measurements as a result of the next general election. He left that question significantly unanswered. So they've already given it away here. Not only do they not really appreciate that gridlock that comes with democracy to make sure that we're slowly moving in the right direction instead of quickly progressing in some random direction or direction of one authoritarian, they also let you understand that you can use the powers of democracy to destroy itself. Once you are democratically elected, you get in there, and now if you are powerful enough and you institute the right planning, you can the people might vote you out next election cycle, and you're like, no, that doesn't count. Have we seen this happen recently? A few times, I want to say.
A little bit.
Right?
Yeah, a little bit.
Putin's been there for a while. I don't know. I mean, it's unfortunate for Russia because all of his opponents get sick, and that sucks. I think you get the cold goes around up there a little bit, I guess, and poison in the. But China, I mean, there's a long list of totalitarian governments that have implemented policies just like this, where you see these presidents last a lot longer than they're supposed to.
Yeah, and so to put a fine point on that, what he gets into here. So to kind of go through the themes of this chapter is where he's like, look, planning and democracy are at odds, just like individualism and collectivism were in chapter 3. And so here are the issues. Consensus. Take a shot every time Truman says consensus in this video. Anyway, but so you have to get around. You will absolutely die. Unless you're me, and you'll just get a slate buzz. And so, but the point is that you won't get consensus. And you had a joke. What was it? I saw your face.
My joke is I'm looking at all the material we still have left and the time we have left. That's the joke.
No, I got this, bro. We got this. So you're not going to get consensus. So you have to, and consensus requires this common core values and And again, he lays this argument out where I think he does such a good job of saying, hey, here, he doesn't just say, you ain't going to get this. He says, here's what I mean by that you have to have, here's the hierarchy of all values of all people in society in order to get consensus. And you have to line those up and come up with a plan that addresses all those. Ain't going to happen. And so as such, one of the ways you can deal with this is to delegate to bureaucracies. And the bureaucracies can come up with stuff. And so that's not inherently bad if they have guardrails and they have an agreed upon end goal. But that's not what happens here. And so here's the footnote thing that he says here. That I want to read this, that addresses, and again, this is so relevant to today. So you can take the word parliament out of this and substitute with Congress, whatever. Parliament nowadays passes so many laws every year that much of the details is so technical as to be unsuited for parliamentary discussion. And he goes on to say, if Parliament were not willing to delegate lawmaking power, Parliament would be unable to pass the kind of quantity of legislation which public opinion requires. And so he goes on to say, many of the laws affect people's lives so closely that elasticity is essential. So the point is he's saying, look, Parliament's supposed to make laws. So who's in Parliament? Back to the thing I said 10 minutes ago. Who's in Parliament? Representatives of the population, right? So the people who represent certain chunks of the population are supposed to get together and make laws that are supposed to be somewhat representative of a consensus of those populations. Okay. They're not going to get that. So they delegate to bureaucracies. Now, those bureaucracies, so they might tell the bureaucracies what to do or vice versa. But the problem is they have to use this vague language because these are not, to what I mentioned earlier, they're not 50-50 issues. And this gets into people's lives at such a level. I think we mentioned this in one of the introductions, is that Parliament is passing laws that like were unheard of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? I think we mentioned that in the introduction video. One of the forwards says that. And so that elasticity is required. So they are going to delegate to these bureaucracies. And either way, whether it's a bureaucracy telling Parliament or vice versa, they're passing laws that no one actually agrees upon. These are not 50-50 issues. Defund the police is not a 50-50 issue, right? It's just not. And this is the thing that the Democrats do now, is they don't have consensus on this stuff. Let's do a national ballot or national. No, not that I trust any type of voting nowadays. And I don't care. I'll say that. But let's do some type of thing where everyone, you can come out and vote on, prop whatever thing. And this is a national thing. Who's going to vote defund the police, right? Like 25% of the population, and so they have to accomplish all these things through mechanisms that do not involve consensus. The opposite of that is this is coercion, in other words, right? Coercion is we're going to force you to go along with us. Passing it without your input, even if it's passing it without a majority input, is coercion. And the other thing that he gets into there, like you said, that quote where he leaves it unanswered, is that and Kevin and I were looking up the Dunmore Committee. This was I think this was one of these things where they were looking into the economy and what should happen with Great Britain in the wake of the Great Depression, because this is like 1929 to like 1931 or 32, something like that. But one of the things that they say in there, and that Lasky guy says, who was a socialist, loved Stalin and Marxism, as you mentioned.
A big fan of Mao.
Big fan of Mao. Yeah. Semis all day thinking about Mao. And so the point is, that's visual. Your imagination is wonderful.
I don't even know the guy.
Right. So, but the point is that one of the things he says is that, and this is one of the things that I think it deals with today, is we have to have safeguards for, let's say we as the labor population passes a bunch of laws, right? Does a bunch of stuff. And then the population says, we hate that. We're going to vote you out of power. That sucks ass. You're not good at this. We're going to vote you out of power. He's saying, look, we need to have safeguards to make sure that whoever gets voted in power doesn't undo what we just did, which is another way of saying, look, an election is the thing that represents the will of the people. We did a bunch of things, and the will of the people, consensus, said we don't like that. We do not like that. And so they vote in another party. The conservatives is what Hayek uses. And he says, look, we have to have safeguards to make sure that they can't undo what we just did, which is another way of saying ignore the will of the people. They voted us out because they don't like what we did. But we need, and like you said, he leaves it unanswered. What do you do? We have to, and so I think part of that is you get rid of the elections, like you were mentioning earlier with
you suspend them. Don't get rid of them. You suspend
them or whatever. Yeah. And so that's the thing we're into today, where you get rid of any procedure that actually reflects consensus and the will of the people. You get rid of that, whether it's the filibuster or you make it to where your shit is permanent. Social Security, who's going to get rid of that? How do you do that? Obamacare, what a nightmare, right? We came close. John McCain sucks. It is what it is. But the point is that these are things that once they are put into place, they are so difficult to get. I mean, they are tumors placed in, like, you can't get them out of the government. And that gets to the last part here when it comes to democracy, which I think we can end on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can fly through this democracy part, but basically the next argument advocates for planning is the democratic aspect. So when you hear democratic socialism, this is exactly what Hayek is talking about, is the belief that so as long as democracy retains its ultimate control, the essentials of democracy are not affected. So he goes in here, and I'm going to paraphrase the German sociologist Karl Mannheim, where he basically says if democracy, a true democracy as we have it, that has limits on it, can do all these different things, why can't a larger, a larger system that can control all these different aspects of socialist system, a collectivist system, do the same thing as long as it's got democracy on it? So really what he's saying is, here's a governing body that has absolute control over the economy and even social life, but it will not or cannot devolve into tyranny if you slap socialism in front of it, or if you slap democracy in front of it. Because if the state has control of everything, but it's sanctioned by democracy, it's sanctioned by the vote of the majority at any given time, it can't be tyrannical. Does this work in theory? Kind of, not really. Does it work in practice? I mean, we've seen it. It does not work in practice. And, Hayek goes on to explain, and I'll just read the highlighted part. This quote, the whole system would tend toward the plebiscitarian dictatorship in which the head of the government is from time to time confirmed in his position by popular vote, but where he has all the powers at his command to make certain that the vote will go in the direction he desires. So he is saying, we're open there, democracy grants the power to its leaders to reject the powers of democracy itself. This is how democracy moves in dictatorship in one move. He goes to continue a quote, when it becomes dominated by a collectivist creed, democracy becomes dominated by a collectivist creed, democracy will inevitably destroy itself. Yep. This is what we were talking about, that it gives the people who are democratically elected the means to destroy that democracy. It's what happened with Hitler. It's happened with plenty of different people. You talk about Putin, you talk about the guy leading China right now. That is what happened.
Xi Jinping. Yeah, and so this is one of the things that, so I mean, I mentioned this, and this is all I'm going to say about it, is I remember, so like I said in the introduction, in the first video we did, is that this book rocked my world, and so I just called people that wanted to talk about it. And one of the people I called is my dad, who, as I mentioned before, my dad is someone who still thinks he's a Democrat, even though he would get ousted from any if he went there and said, here's what I think. The Civil War was about economy. It's like, all right, my book. I helped my dad move all these books. By helped, I mean I moved all these books for my dad, and he has this whole library. It's all this stuff about the Confederacy, and I'm like, this is the hate section of the. Like, my dad really thinks he's a Democrat. Anyway, but whenever one of the people I called was my dad, because my dad's older. He's in his early 70s, and so he remembered. He was alive during a lot, I guess the main parts of the Cold War. Was kind of the decades of his early to middle life. And so I called him to ask him about it, and I talked about socialism, because this is what Hayek is talking about. And my dad and I were the people who, and I said this multiple times, I used to think socialism was like roads and stuff, because I had shit for brains before reading books and stuff. And when I called him about it, he made the same things. He's like, well, no, it's democratic socialism. It's democratic socialism. Like, it's the Democratic People's Republic of Congo, right? It's the Democratic, People's Republic of North Korea.
Yeah.
Right.
North
and
Korea's
so,
a fun one.
And so it's got democracy in front of it. So if it's democratic, it's like shit sandwich. It's a sandwich. It's just a sandwich. And so, like, that's the thing that they were doing. Again, this is the prescience. Map it onto today. People were like, well, if it has this, it's anti-racist, right? Black lives matter. Like, they matter, And so all of these things. And so it's this word game where if you put these words in it, it's another way of, I don't know if you watched the movie Super Size Me, the second one that Morgan Spurlock did.
Second one.
It's really good. So he goes into this thing where I forgot what his main goal was, but then the movie ends up being all about the chicken industry. And he talks about these terms, like he calls them halo terms, like free range. And so there's these halo terms in the food industry that make it to where people just assume it's good. Like free range is one of those. And so I think democratic is one of those things. It's like a halo term that gets slapped onto a lot of these things, that it just lowers your guard to whether or not it's good or not. And it's just not how it actually works. Just because someone calls it like, okay, let's try this: democratic Nazism, democratic racism, democratic genocide. Like, pick a term and tell me that if someone put democratic in front of it, that it makes it necessarily good, right? And so democratic socialism is one of those things that I think that because they slapped that on the front of it, and as Hayek mentions, maybe it actually was democratically achieved. Maybe they really did vote it in, like Putin, like Hitler. When did Hitler win? Was that 32, maybe 33?
33. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, maybe it was that, but just because it was democratically achieved doesn't mean anything. And that's why we don't live in a democracy, by the way, in the United States.
Yeah. Democratic Nazism is garbage. Gluten-free Nazism. Meh.
I'm all aboard.
It's
all aboard.
right? I think it's another Halo term, but so I'm going to get into really how Hayek ends the chapter. And I'm going to just go through all the bold sections here, but his last two paragraphs are terrific.
They are.
Quote, "We have no intention, however, of making a fetish of democracy. It may well be true that our generation talks and thinks too much of democracy and too little of the values which it serves. Democracy is essentially a means, a utilitarian device for safeguarding internal peace and individual freedom. Individual freedom. And to continue the quote, a true dictatorship of the proletariat or working class, even if democratic in form, if it undertook centrally to direct the economic system, would probably destroy personal freedom as completely as any autocracy ever has done." So to go back to kind of the first point of fetishizing democracy, this reminded me a lot of when he said, do not stick the dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes. It's like, if you're going to the extreme, you're doing it wrong. The reason we like democracy, the reason we like laissez-faire economics, is because they're the best vehicle to maintain individual freedom. But that does not mean that vehicle cannot go off the road. It does not mean that keep going.
No, I was just say, and whenever to marry this, take a shot, guys. To marry this consensus, democracy in people's mind represents consensus. Democracy means most people think X. So in a democracy, whatever X is the thing that most people think and agree on. And so what Hayek is saying here is democracy is a way of achieving good things, but like liberty, I think is the quote, is it's the thing, democracy is the thing you're aiming for. But or that you're using. Liberty is the final end goal of all of it. Liberty is freedom. Liberty is freedom. And so if you're using democracy as a substitute mentally for, like we were saying earlier, defining liberty, or not liberty, liberalism or planning or whatever. Hey, when you hear this word, think this. I think most people hear democracy and they think consensus. And the problem with democratic socialism, democracy in Congo or Korea or whatever, is it's not consensus. It's not. It's just not. And it will not happen with these policies.
Absolutely. So then he really ends the final chapter, and I'll just go through, a really small piece of it here, but he talks about arbitrary power, and that the source of power is not, or is not the source, but the limitation of power in which prevents it from being arbitrary. Democratic control may prevent the power from becoming arbitrary, but it does not do so by its mere existence. If democracy resolves on a task which necessarily involves the use of power which cannot be guided by fixed rules, it must become arbitrary power. Now, fixed rules is what kind of moves us into chapter 6. It's called planning and the rule of law. But really, he talks about when power becomes arbitrary, meaning the power is used without concern of law or specific reasoning, it will become tyrannical, even if a majority of people should believe that this power ought to be used. Yeah, and if you have anything to add to it, I also pulled
I do.
Go ahead.
Big surprise here, right?
Yes.
Truman has something to say. No, I was gonna say, right, I will not use the C word. But no, I think that quote is worth saying. It is not, or saying again, repeating, it is not the source. So to democratic socialism or whatever, It's not the source, but the limitation of power that prevents it from being arbitrary. Hey, people at home, if you're still here, when you hear arbitrary, think something that people just flying off the handle. That's what the United States rebelled against. That's monarchies, right? So he's saying, look, the means by which power achieve power isn't the thing. Don't get hung up on that. It's what limits the way that it exercises that power. That's the thing to focus on. Okay. So in the United States, that's what the Constitution does, right? Shall make no law, shall make no law, shall make no law, right? That's it. It's a limiting document for the government, right? It's freedom from, not freedom to. And so this is such a huge distinction here, where there are these people who think that we have freedom to all these things, and the government is supposed to give us freedom to things. But no. It's not that. It's freedom from. And so limiting the power of government is what matters most. It's not how the government came to be. It's not where it got its power, whatever, democratic, whatever. It's how do you limit that power to keep it from becoming arbitrary, which another way of saying is it just does whatever the it wants at any given moment, any given time, which is what planning necessitates, by the way. And I think we've hit on that before. But that's the only thing I would add there is that quote of like, that's why the democratic socialism or democratic People's Republic of dog shit, whatever, doesn't matter, is it's not how they gained power. It's what are the guardrails or the limits of that power that you have to focus on.
100%.
I didn't 100%. Use the word.
The C word, which is, if you're hopping in now, is different than what you think it is. So there is a quote that I pulled that was kind of more toward the middle of the chapter, but I loved it because it perfectly encompassed kind of a lot of what he talked about here, if not everything. But it's quote, Hitler did not have to destroy democracy. He merely took advantage of the decay of democracy and at a critical moment obtained the support of many whom, though they detested Hitler, he yet seemed the only man strong enough to get things done. He gained power using democracy. He then used those powers granted to him by democracy to destroy it. He used economic and social planning to systematically kill millions of his own people. He used the power of the mob to follow him into war. This didn't happen because they were German. This didn't happen because it was a nation full of ethno-nationalists. They weren't. It was this crazy guy. And this happened because they turned their back on true liberalism and traded in for collectivism.
Yep.
This is what happens with planning, because this is a requirement of planning. And this is how you go down the road to serfdom. Yeah.
I mean, this is exactly right. There's not really anything to add to that. I think people get the point, is that you can vote your way into slavery. You know, Xi Jinping, they removed term limits, and I think it was the Soviet Union just a couple of years ago. They got rid of all the opposition to Vladimir Putin, which, by the way, this is why I don't. So to bring it back to the Michael Malice thing that I was quoting more at the beginning, this is why I don't think Michael Malice has the right answer. It's like, what do you do about China and Russia? Here's some words, but that's it. And so, but the point is, there are these places that people voted themselves into tyranny. Hitler was democratically elected, Reichstag fire, you know, and he wasn't even elected as the leader of Germany. He convinced, I forgot who the leader of Germany was, convinced him to give Hitler the power, be the vice chancellor or whatever it was. And so the fact that someone chose, you know, go to Yao Min Park, right? And she mentions when she escaped North Korea, she was in human trafficking, right? She was a sex slave. She chose to go into that. She chose to go into slavery, you know? And so that happened with early Christian missionaries who went to these islands where you had to be a slave to get there, where they said, I'm going to voluntarily go into slavery. So the point is that because you chose a thing or because you chose a person doesn't mean that you necessarily, one, know what you're choosing, or two, that you can, here's the thing. I think I mentioned being cliffed out and some other thing. Like, because you chose a thing doesn't mean you can unchoose it. Right. So when you hear democracy, you think I chose it so I can unchoose it. And that's not how this works. That's not how this ideology works. You can't unchoose some things. You can't. And this is a thing that once it's been chosen, it just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. And it's like the, you know, the plant in Little Shop of Horrors, right? Like, holy shit, I keep feeding this thing. I'm done. You know, feed me, Seymour. Like, it's like, nope, can't unfeed it. Can't, you know, unmake this. And that's how this ideology works, is it'll do whatever it needs to do, including deceive you, coerce you, propagandize you into and acquiescing to it so it can get power, but you can't unchoose it. You can't unpick it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. And perfect way to end the chapter, because we kind of have to in a minute. But thank you for listening. No, you did great. Thank you for listening. If you haven't listened to the previous 3 episodes of this, go check it out. You know, if it's later and we have more episodes, at least go check it out. It's really, really awesome to listen. I know I have a ton of fun doing this. Actually, really excited. Like, it's really late by me, and I'm an old man, so I go to bed early. So I was super tired at the beginning. And now I'm like all riled up and like ready to talk about the next chapter. So it kind of sucks, but is what it is. But if you want to try to support Truman, find more of his stuff, check out returntoreason.locals.com. Look for Return to Reason on YouTube, Medium, Twitter. You're at My Mundane Mind, ThinkSpot. I didn't mention that. Return to Reason, and you can find them and support them on all those places. Did I miss anything there?
My grinder, but it's a name that I don't feel comfortable saying on here.
That's fine.
Yep.
My grinder is Engineering Politique. It's got a little accent there. So. But you can find me and support me at engineeringpolitics.locals.com, Engineering Politics on YouTube, ThinkSpot, Medium, and ENG_politics on Twitter.
Yep. Can I point out? Hey, Kevin, do this. Put it up. There it is. Boy, Kevin just got married. He's got the wedding band on. So be sure you have to support him now. Do as a wedding gift, right?
I mean, all of your support's going to go to my wife, but yeah.
That's right. Hey, that's okay. That's okay. She's a victim of the patriarchy. So, you know, bring it home to Kevin's wife. So congrats again to you, buddy. It's cool seeing you with that wedding band
it's
on.
Weird.
Man.
Like, I got the silicone one on now, but I wore the metal one for the first day and I never had it on. I was fidgeting with it constantly.
I take them off because whenever I'm eating or something, I get food and stuff underneath of it. And so like, I literally grab my rings and wear them for videos. Because I often wear them out line.
Taken ladies,
no, I am married.
Taken ladies, still single on Grindr, but you know, taken here.
That's right. No, that's a whole different thing. Yeah. So thanks again for watching, guys. We'll see you next time. This has been awesome. Kevin, thanks again. And we'll see you next time. Peace.
See ya.